What's up everybody, welcome back. So in the previous video we started setting up a little bit of our framework and we have our main menu set up. We can hit the solo button and we can walk around with our little girl in the level and shoot around a bit. So we have a pretty solid start, and in this video we're going to look at creating a session and joining a session for our multiplayer setup. But first of all, I wanted to do a little introduction into multiplayer, and this is really for the beginners. So I'm still a beginner as well, but I want to try and explain a little bit what's going on. So if you're a little bit into multiplayer already, you can probably skip this. So as I usually do, I'll put chapters in the timeline and you can simply hover over the timeline and look for a part of the video that does interest you. But for now, I'm gonna try and explain what would happen if we are playing a multiplayer game and what different classes, how they behave and things like that. So I made a little scene, and this would represent a single player game. The cube would be the computer, the dude behind is playing it, and this would be the character in game. So that would be the character blueprint, for example. And this would be a simple single player game. Now what would happen if we would turn this into a multiplayer game? Then all of a sudden we have two instances of the game with both two characters and there's two people playing. And this would be a listen server model, so that would be a pretty common model used for Unreal Engine. This means that one of the players is also the host. Another option would be to run a dedicated server, and in that case there would be a separate computer that would be the host, and for that computer there would be nobody playing, so that would only be the host and all players would be clients. And a benefit from that would be that the host would have to do no visual or audio or play effects and things like that, because there's nobody actually playing behind that machine, and also none of the people playing would have the benefit of being the host because everybody is a client. So there's a small difference between that, but in big lines you can compare it somewhat. But we're going to look at the listen server model, and that looks like this. And in that case, one of the players is the host and the other players will be clients. And in this case, every instance of the game has two characters in them, and one is a local character. But that doesn't really mean it's a host or a client. The local character just means that's the character that's being controlled by the dude behind the computer. So that's the local character, as the name says. And then for every person playing, there is a character in that game as well. Now if we would bump this up to a 4-player multiplayer, this would look something like this. So you'd have 4 instances of the game. Every instance would have 4 characters in them, and every instance also has a different local character, obviously. So this would be a common setup for a multiplayer 4-player game. Now what would happen if a client would try to move his pawn? In that case, it would actually tell the server he wants to move his pawn, and the server will move the pawn on his game instance, and that will be replicated to all the other games, and then the other instances will also move the pawn. So that's the model that we're going to have to work with. So the server has authority over everything that happens in the game, and we need to tell the server if we want to do something for important gameplay tasks. So that's the setup for multiplayer. Until now that's not too complicated, but we're also dealing with different classes. So for example, we have game modes, player controllers, things like that, and that's where things can get a bit more tricky, because every class has its own behavior. So a player controller, for example, will exist for a local player on a machine, and it will exist on the host. So the host has access to all player controllers from all players in the game, but clients only have access to their own player controller. So if I'm this purple dude over here, I would never be able to tell something to the blue guy's player controller because I simply do not have access to it. It doesn't exist to me. So in that case, I would also need to talk to the host. And the host has access to all player controllers and can use that to tell players to do things or create a HUD or something like that. A game mode, on the other hand, only exists on the host. So clients do not have access to the active game mode, and the actual game mode that's running the game only exists on the host, and only the host has access to it. So you need to keep those things in mind when you're working with different classes. They behave differently. Besides these classes, we also have a GameState, and the GameState is a class that replicates through all players, and it will exist for all players as well. And normally it's not really used for game logic, but it's more to tell all clients or all characters information about the game, or something like which team is winning or how long the game has been going on. And you could use that for things like a HUD or a scoreboard or things like that. So this is more to spread information throughout the game, and it's replicated for each character or each player, and also exists on all machines or all instances of the game. And the same thing happens with a PlayerState, which is kind of the same thing, but then for a player instead of for the game. So this also replicates freely between all players, and it exists on all machines. And you could use this to keep your score for the HUD or for your scoreboard or things like that, to replicate it between players so everybody knows about it. So things get a little bit more tricky when we're dealing with different classes, and then we're also dealing with the fact that a different class can execute different events, and those can also behave differently. So for example, if I would look at a PlayerController for the blue guy over here, that would exist on his local machine and on the server. And the PlayerController can execute event begin play, for example, when the game starts. And event begin play will execute both locally and on the host. So it will happen on both machines. But a PlayerController also executes event possessed, for example, and event possessed will only execute on the host and not on a local machine. So you need to make sure that you know a bit of the basics when you're working with this stuff. Otherwise it's going to get real complicated, because you think you're doing things right, it's not working, and you're simply trying to do something that just can't be done. Just because classes behave differently and events behave differently. So this is what you have to keep in mind, and I would suggest dive into some documentation or watch some tutorial videos like you're doing right now to get the basics, and that would really help you to get things going. So I hope that made a little bit of sense, and we're gonna continue by setting up a little bit of our game. So first of all, I wanted to mention that I renamed a few blueprints because it got a little bit confusing when I was searching for them. So if you are following with the tutorial and want to keep the naming conventions the same, then you might want to do the same thing. So I had the MpMenu Shooter GameMode, the BP Shooter Menu Controller, and the BP Shooter Menu Pawn. And I also had the Shooter GameMode, so that got a little bit confusing. So I changed this to the MpMenu GameMode, and that used to be Shooter Menu GameMode. And this is the Menu Controller, and that used to be the Shooter Menu Controller. And this is the Menu Pawn, and that used to be the Shooter Menu Pawn. So I just got rid of the shooter in these three ones to make things a little bit less confusing. One thing to mention, when I start a new project, I usually immediately enable the other filters and show redirectors. So that way, if I rename or move a file and a redirector pops up, I can immediately fix it up. So that might be something you want to look at as well. So with that out of the way, I want to dive in the GameInstance, and as a little bit of a precaution, we're going to go to the load profile function. So we have the check for save game function, and that checks if a save game exists. If it doesn't exist, it will create a save game, and when it does, it will also store the save game object as a variable on the GameInstance. But if we look over here and the save game does exist, we're simply going to load it. But in that case, we are not storing the save game object over here. And in case we might want to access it later, I want to prevent that we forget it. So I'm simply going to drag it onto the return node over here, and then go back to the check for saved profile function and make sure that I set it when we load the profile. So that way we're sure it's always correctly loaded, and we do not forget about it if we want to do something in here later. So with that out of the way, let's dive into our menus, and let's create the multiplayer menu. First I'm going to open up my main menu and I want to add a little title bar in here. So I'm going to move the borders down a little bit. They're at 100 and I'm going to set them at 300. And then I'm going to grab a new border and drop it on the canvas panel over here. And make sure that it's aligned top center or anchored, sorry, and then position, zero it out. The second position would be down, so maybe 100 units down. Then make sure it's across the entire screen and center it out with the alignment. And need to lower the opacity a little bit, so something about 0.5, and then I'm simply going to drop some text on here. And this is going to be our main menu. And let's copy the font. So copy and paste it. And increase the size a bit. So maybe in 58, something like that. So we need to center it and then increase the border. There we go. So we have somewhat of a title going on. Then I'm gonna close it down and simply duplicate this and call this my multiplayer menu. So MpMenu. Let's open it up, and first let's change the title over here, so that's multiplayer. And now we can get rid of this player name input, so we can simply delete it. We don't need it in this menu. So for the buttons, we can keep the host and search game. I'm gonna move the solo game to below search game. So that would be over here. And then I'm gonna change the text on here. So this would be my button connection type. And the text will be connection. And then let me increase the border a little bit. Now I'm gonna grab a simple border and drop it in the vertical box as well. And on there I'm gonna drop some text again. So that would be this border. And let me see, we need to make the border a little bit darker. So let's zero this out and give it some alpha, something like this. Then we need to get the font in here, so we can select the text and probably still paste that. That would be good to go. Let's center it, and then the text would be long. And this could also be online if we switch between local area network or online gameplay. So let me move this above the quit button. And then let's move the spacers around a bit as well. So we got a spacer over here. Let's put this above the quit button, and then we have a spacer over here. Let's put this above the connection type, so something like this. And now we can adjust the border again. There we go. So we have an empty border in here because I dragged the text out of it probably. So this should be over here. There we go. So we have the text for the local area network, and I'm gonna say this as a variable. So this is my text connection type. And we need to make sure this is a variable. So on the top right over here, enable it. And for the other buttons, we should be good to go. So we can pretty much keep them. And this is what we're going to use for our multiplayer menu to start with. So now we need to go back into our main menu because we also created the host and search game buttons in there. So we get an error because we removed the input box and we still have it in the graph. So you can remove that to get rid of the error if you like. So we're going to go back to the main menu. And over here we have the host and search game buttons. I'm going to remove one of them. And for the other one, I'm going to call it multiplayer, so we can open our multiplayer menu from here. So multiplayer. And make sure I change the button name as well. So multiplayer game. And that should be good to go. So get the border size nice. There we go. Now let's have a look at setting this up in the game instance and showing the different menus. Let's start with the game instance so we can show the new multiplayer menu. So let's open up our game instance, and I'm simply gonna do pretty much the same as for the main menu. So let's duplicate this function and call this UI show MpMenu. So in here we can get rid of the main menu variables, and we can get rid of the stuff at the end here as well. So we don't need to set the input mode, mouse cursor, or the profile stuff. We don't need it in this case. So simply plug the return node back into the add to viewport node. And then over here we're going to select our multiplayer menu, and we can promote this to a new variable, and that's our widget blueprint multiplayer menu. And now we can connect everything back up. So this should be into the add to viewport, and we should check if it's valid and then add it to the viewport. So we should be good to go over here. Now we need to go into our main menu and multiplayer menu to set up the buttons for opening them. So let's go into those widgets. Let's do the main menu first. So if we dive into the graph, we can add a new onClicked for the MpMenu button. So select it and add the onClicked. And then we can simply drag in our shooter game instance, get it, and show the other menu. So show multiplayer menu. And after we did this, we only need to remove the main menu. So we're going to remove from parent. And that's our main menu. So that's self, and that should be good to go. Now we can do the same thing for the multiplayer menu. So if we open up our multiplayer menu and go into the graph, then we're going to select our main menu button. So I probably didn't rename that. So that's the quit game button, and that should be multiplayer, or that should be main menu. So let's rename it, and also over here, button main menu. So now if we go into the graph, we can add an onClicked for this, or we already have it actually. And over here we are going to do the same thing as we did. So we're going to grab our game instance, and we're going to show our main menu. And from here we're going to remove the current one from our parent. And that should be good to go as well. So now we need to take a look at our ConnectionType button. To do this, we need to open up our game instance, and I'm gonna add a new boolean in here, and that's called is LAN connection. So is LAN connection, and we're gonna create a new function in here as well to change it, and we're gonna call that change connection type. So let's get a branch in here, and we're going to check our current state of the boolean. So drag it in on top of the branch, and then we're simply going to change it to the other state. So drag into setters. So if it's true, we're going to set it to false, and if it's false, we're going to set it to true. And then let's get a return node, so we can also retrieve what value we are on currently. So for this, we can drag in the bool on top of the return node, and that should be good to go. Now let's open up the multiplayer menu again, and in here we're going to create a function as well, and we're going to call it setConnectionType text. So let's go into the graph, and let's create a new function, setConnectionType text. And for this we need one input, and that's the boolean. So is LAN connection. And then all we need to do in here is get a bool again and plug it in. So we made the text into a variable, so we can drag it in the graph over here, and then we're gonna drag off and set the text. And if it's true, that's going to be 1. And if it's false, I'm gonna say, no, that was a wrong paste. I'm gonna say the text is online. And that's all we need to do in here. So let's grab a return node and hook it up. And now we can go, we need to make sure we plug in the text object over here as well. And now if we go into the event graph on event construct, I want to make sure that it always reflects the correct value. So I'm simply going to drag off my game instance and get the bool. And make sure that we set it to the correct text, so we can drop in our function and plug it in like this. So that way, if we change it in the game instance, we are sure that the menu reflects the correct value as well. So that's out of the way. Let's set up the actual joining and creating of sessions. So for this we need our game instance again, and we're going to create the events we need. So let's go to the event graph and let's create a new custom event. First, create MP session. And let's set this up first. So let's drag in our isSoloGame boolean, and we're going to set this to false. And then we're going to grab the create session node to create the actual session. So create session. And for this we need to plug in our PlayerController, so we can simply get PlayerController and hook it up over here. We need to set the maximum amount of players, so I'm gonna set it to 4. And for the LAN, I'm gonna drop in our isLAN connection boolean. So after this, on success, you want to drag in the open level node, and we can open up our lobby level. So let's go into the content drawer and let's make sure we get the correct name. So we have our lobby level map, and I'm simply going to paste it in here. And there's one important setting over here, that's the option, and you need to type listen in here, and that will allow other players to join the session. So if you want, you could add a print in here when the creating of the session fails, so you know it failed. So I'm going to do that real quickly and copy the text from my example project. So I simply have here failed to create session, and I put in a game instance and the name of the function. So if I have a lot of prints, I can still remember where this is from. So this is all we need to do to create a multiplayer session. Now let's also create a function to join a session. So let's get another custom event in here and call this join MP session. And for this we need an input, so create an input, and that's going to be the session result. And that's going to be a blueprint session result. So you can look for blueprint and this will pop up, blueprint session result. So first of all, we're also going to set the solo game boolean to false in here. And after that we need a join session node, so we can simply look for join session. Again, we need to plug in our PlayerController, so we can get it like this. And then the search result comes from the input node or the event node. And that's all we need to do in here. If we successfully connect to the session, then it will automatically load into the lobby menu map. Again, you could add a print in here on failure if you would like to, so then at least you know if something goes wrong. So that's the second event that we need, and now we can go into our multiplayer menu to set things up. Back in our multiplayer menu, let's do the host game button first, because that's really pretty simple. So we're simply going to get an on-clicked event for the host game button, and from here we can call the event that we just created in the game instance. So get our game instance reference over here and simply create MP session. And that's all we need to do in here. So for joining a session, we need a little bit more work. And first we're going to go into the designer and we're going to add a little slot where we can display the servers that we actually found. So to do that, I'm going to add a border again and simply drop it on the canvas panel over here. Now let me get my example project so I can eat with the values. So I have it set to 750, 200 and 300 from the top. So over here, let's anchor it to 0 from the center. Then it's 0, 300 from the top like the others, and then it's 750 wide and 200 big. And I need to align it like 0.5 so it's centered. Then I'm going to drop down the alpha again. So in this border, I'm going to drag in a scroll box that should be inside the panels over here. Scroll box. And just drop it on top of the border. And this will be the actual server list. So a scroll box is something like this. That will have the, well, it's actually the details panel. So it has the scroll bar on the side. And if there's more values than there can actually be displayed in this box, then you're able to scroll up and down. So we can populate this with the session results that we find. So first of all, I want to make this border a variable. So I'm going to give it a name, and that's my border server list. And I also want to make the scroll box a variable, so that's my scroll box server list. And get rid of the space. I don't like spaces in my variable names. So make sure they are variables on the top right over here, both the border and the scroll box. And with that out of the way, we need to create a new widget. So let's get our content drawer up in the widgets folder, and I'm going to create a user interface widget blueprint, the user widget class. Oh, come on. And I'm going to call this my widget blueprint server row. And let's open that up, and that's actually going to be pretty simple. So let me open it in my example project as well. So first we're going to drag in a canvas panel again, like we usually do. And on top of the canvas panel, we're going to drop in a border, a button. And we can give this button a size. So again, I'm going to cheat by looking at the values for my example project. And I gave it 750 by 35. And for the border itself, I'm going to give it a black background. So zero this out. And then I'm going to put the alpha at 0.7 for the normal one. And for the hovered one, this is going to be all zeros and then 1 alpha. And for the pressed one, all zeros and 0.3 alpha. And on top of this border, I'm going to get myself a horizontal box and drop it in here. And in the horizontal box, I'm going to drop 3 text objects. So get the normal text and drop it in here. Now I'm going to copy the font from my example project. It's the same font as I use in the main menu, but it's just a bit smaller. So I have it set to 20. So if I paste it over here, that should work. So it's simply italic and then size 20. That's pretty much all, but whatever. And for this, I want to rename it. So this is going to be my text server name. And let's give it an actual text for now as well. So server name. And this needs to be a variable. So enable the is variable on the top right over here. And for the alignment, I'm going to set it to fill and then all the way to the right and centered over here. And then I have the minimal desired width set as well, and I set it at 175, so it's a little bit bigger, so it doesn't move around as much. Then I'm simply going to duplicate this, and this is going to be my number of players. So text num players. What happened? Oh, come on. Text num players. So let me see, that's a variable, that's fine, and that's going to be something like 0-0. So for aligning this, we need to set it to fill and then center and center. That should be good. Desired width, I have it at 120, and then I have this centered. So the actual justification of the text is centered. And I didn't know for the server name. No, that's fine. We can leave it to left. So let's duplicate this again. And the last one is going to be, and there we go, our text ping. And that's going to be the speed of the connection. So let's say something about 0 milliseconds. And for aligning this, let's have a look. Align it to the right and then centered, that's fine. And I also have it set to desired width 175 and justification centered, so that's good, I think. And then for the horizontal box, we probably want to fill it, so that looks a little bit better. So this is going to be the server row widget that we were going to use inside the scroll box, and we need to set it up in the graph as well. So let's dive into the graph. And we need a variable in here, and that's going to be our blueprint session result. So let's create that first, and that's the session result. And that's a blueprint session result. And we also need a reference to the multiplayer menu. So create another variable, widget blueprint MpMenu. And that's the widget blueprint MpMenu variable. There we go. So the first thing we are going to do is create a new function in here. So let's just get rid of this stuff, and we're going to create a custom event and call it update server row info. And that has a session result as an input. So give it an input, session result. And that's our blueprint session result again. So the first thing we're going to do is set the actual variable on this widget. So drag in a setter and plug it in over here. And then we're going to populate the text in our widget. So let's drag in the server name first, and we're going to get a set text. And from the session result, we can drag off and get a little bit of information. So unfortunately, it's not a lot. I hoped they would have expanded this in Unreal Engine 5, but they didn't. So these are the only things we can actually get in a blueprint session. So the current amount of players, the maximum amount of players, the ping, and the server name. So if you want to get more information, you would have to dive into third-party plugins, or you would have to work through C++. So for now, this is all we have to work with. So we're going to get the server name. Now this is going to return a huge name, and what I'm going to do to keep things a little bit clean is split the string. And this will simply split it in two pieces, and this would give something like my computer name and then a dash and then a whole lot of numbers. So I'm going to put a dash in the string to search, and then it will search from the start, and it will split the string in two parts, and everything right to the dash I don't want to use it, so I only want to use the left string, and I'm simply going to plug it in here, and it will create a toText, so that's fine. So that will set the server name. Now we're going to drag in the text number of players and also get the set text node and hook it up. Now we can get the session result over here, and we can get the amount of players and the maximum amount of players. So let's get both of those. Maximum players. And let's also get the current amount of players. And then over here I'm going to get a format text node. And for this we can simply plug in parameters. So if I do an open bracket, open bracket A, close bracket, and then a dash, and then open bracket B, close bracket, then those will return as wildcards, and I can plug things in here. So this would be my current amount of players in A, and my maximum amount of players in B, and that would be the text for the amount of players. And the last thing we want to do is set the ping text. So again, we're going to drop in the object over here and set the text. Now we're going to get the ping from the session result. So drag over here, get ping in milliseconds, and we're going to format text again. So I want this to be the wildcard and then milliseconds, and I can simply plug this in over here and plug this in the set text node. So this will display the correct information. And let me see, I think we can also set up the onClicked event in here. So if we this entire widget is a button, so this would have an onClicked event, so we can look for the button over here and add onClicked. So we want to get our game instance. So if we click this button, we're gonna join the session. So we're gonna get our game instance, and we want to cast it to our shooter game instance. And from here we can call our join session event. So join MP session, and for the result we can drag in the variable that we have stored on here. And then we could disable some buttons on the multiplayer menu. So let me see the server list and the menu buttons, and I don't think we have them set up as variables. So we do have the server list, but for the menu buttons I'm gonna promote the border to a variable as well. So border menu buttons is variable, and then compile and save it. Now I can go back into my server row, and over here we have a reference to the multiplayer menu. So I'm gonna get my border menu buttons and my server list, and I'm simply gonna set these to not enabled. So drag over here, set enabled, and set it to false. So that way, if I have clicked the join game button, I would need to wait for something to happen, and I cannot mess everything up. So this is what we are going to use for the server row widget. We're gonna save and close it down. And back in the multiplayer menu, we can now set up the actual search game function. So let's go into our graph and let's get an onClicked for the search game. There we go. So let's get in our border server list here, and we want to make sure that we can see it. So we need to make sure that it's visible. So set visibility and set it to visible. So by default, we're actually gonna hide it. So let's go to the designer and let's select our server list, and on the right side here, let's set it to hidden. And now we're gonna grab our border server list, our scrollbox server list. So that's the actual list with the servers, and we're gonna clear it. So if we open up the menu again, for example, and there's still stuff left in there, we need to get rid of it. So we're gonna clear the children, and we're also gonna need an array in here. So we're gonna create that. That's a new variable, and that's going to be all server row info widget blueprints, and those are server row widget blueprints, and that's an array. So we're gonna drag in that array over here, and we're gonna clear it as well. So we're gonna start with a clean slate. Every time we open up the menu, or every time we click the button, I'm sorry. So after we click the button, I'm gonna set the text on the actual button. So that's my text search game button, and I don't know if that's a variable yet. So let's select it over here. It's not, so I'm gonna rename it text search game button, and that's a variable. Go back to the graph and drag it in. So I'm gonna set the text of the button and I'm gonna set it to searching. Then I want to get my border menu buttons and I want to disable it. So I can't go around and press all other kinds of buttons. So set enabled and set it to false. So disabling the border will disable all the buttons inside of it. So that's just a little simple trick. Now we're going to actually find the sessions. So look for the find sessions node and plug it in over here. So for this we need our player controller. So simply look for player controller and plug it in. We need to set up a maximum amount. So something like 10 or 15 might do fine. We have a scroll box, so everything should fit. And we need our LAN connection boolean, so we're going to get it from our GameInstance, and we have a reference to that, so we're going to drag it in, get LAN connection, and plug it in the find session node. So let's do on failure first. Obviously it failed, so we're gonna add a little print so we can at least see something went wrong. And I'm gonna copy and paste the text from my example project. So it simply says search failed and then where that is coming from. So my multiplayer menu button search game. And then we need to make sure that we reset a few things. So we're gonna get our text search game button and we're gonna set the text back to the original text. So drag it in here, and that would be search game. And we also want to make sure that we enable all the buttons again. So get our border menu buttons and set it back to enabled. And that's done. So then we can drag off the results over here. This will return an array. So first of all, let's see if there's actually something in here. So let's get the length of the array. And let's get a branch, check if this is 0 or not. So equal and plug it in. So we're going to plug this into the on success pin. So if this is true, then again, we don't have any sessions. So I'm simply going to print something that says no sessions found. And then also make sure you plug it into the reset nodes over here for the search game button text and the border. So no sessions found. And then when we actually did find something, we need to do some stuff. So we're going to get a for each loop over here and we can plug in the array that came from the find sessions node. And hook this up to the false pin over here. Now for each entry in this array, we're going to create a server row widget. So we're going to create a widget. And that's our server row that we just created. So we're going to plug this in like so. So let's go into the server row widget because I forgot a little thing. So let's open up our content drawer and open up our server row. So in here we set the multiplayer menu reference and we need to make sure that it's instance editable, and we also enable expose on spawn. And if we do that and we compile and save it, then we can go back to the multiplayer menu and refresh this node. And now it will actually have a pin for that variable if we expose it on spawn. So we can simply drag off here and type self as a reference for the multiplayer menu. And for the owning player, that's going to be our player controller. So get player controller. And that will create the widget. So for this widget, we want to set it up. So we can drag off here and do update server row info. So that's the custom event that we created. And in here, we can simply plug in the session result from the array. So this will populate it with the correct name and the amount of players and the ping. And then we need to make sure that we store this in an array so we can get rid of it later. So we're going to drag in our all server row widgets and we're going to add a new item to it, connect it up over here, and the item we're adding is the widget that we just created. And then all we need to do is make sure that it's actually inside of our scroll box. So we're going to get our scroll box server list and we're going to add a child. Connect it up, and the child is going to be the blueprint, the widget that we just created. So we can hook it up over here. And this will populate the scroll box with all the servers that we found. And then we can click on the little scroll box list thingy and that will load us into the game. Or that's the ID actually. Now I think we only need to set up a little bit in our begin play. So that's not begin play but event construct in this case. And in here we are going to reset a few things. So if we open it up, we know the menu is fresh and good to go. So first of all, we're going to get our scrollbox server list. And we're going to clear all children. Plug it in here. Then we're also going to get our array of server info rows and we're going to clear it just to make sure. And then we want to make sure that the text for the search game button is also correct. So drag it off here, set text. So this is mainly when we have played a game, for example, and we go back to the main menu and then we open up the multiplayer menu again. Then we want to make sure that everything represents the correct values and texts again. So that's what we're doing here. So we're setting the text back to search game. And we want to make sure that our menu buttons are enabled and also our border server list is enabled. So drag both of them in here and set enabled to true. And make sure you connect both of them. And the last thing we want to do is hide the border server list. So it only shows if you're actually searching for a game. So set visibility. And we're going to set this to hidden. So I think this should do it. And we could be ready to test it. So let's make sure we save everything in case of a horrible crash. And then let's set the number of players to 2. And the net mode should be standalone. That's fine. And let's launch this. So we have 2 menus. Let's see how we're going to align this. So we have 2 of the same names. That's because they still use the same information. So we could work our way around it by simply hosting a game first on one side. And then we can change the name on the other side. And then both of us will have different names. So now I can search a game over here. So the layout is messed up because it's not full screen. But oh, now it's working. And you can see the actual server is popping up over here and I can select it and then it should connect to it. And here we go. So now both of the players are in the lobby level and they are connected to each other. Unfortunately, there's not really a whole lot we can do yet, but we have the basics set up and we can create a session, join a session, and we have a little bit of server information on the screen. So for this video, I think we're gonna stop, and in the next video we're gonna continue and we're gonna set up our lobby a bit more. So we have a widget in the lobby, we can start the game, and we can also see the players that are connected to the lobby. So thanks for watching everybody. I hope you enjoyed the video and I hope everything made a little bit of sense. If you like, you can join the GameDev Raw Discord and talk about game dev stuff or ask questions about videos or simply show off something of a project that you made. And otherwise, I hope to see you in the next video. Thanks for watching everybody. Talk to you later.